Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Recovery to Practice webinar titled Recovery-Oriented Crisis Services, Applying Principles of Open Dialogue and Peer Support. My name is Elizabeth Whitney, and I'll be your host for today. After a short overview of Recovery to Practice, we'll begin today's presentation. On behalf of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration and the Recovery to Practice team, we'd like to welcome you all and to thank you for joining us today. We already have almost 250 members in the audience, so welcome. I'd also like to thank our presenters, Dr. Chris Gordon and Keith Scott, for sharing their knowledge and experience with us today. A couple of details. At the end of the session, you will be able to download a certificate of attendance that you can use for applying for continuing education credits for your professional organization. And this webinar has been pre-approved for continuing education hours from NADAC, the Addiction Professionals Association. To qualify for these continuing education hours, you must attend the full webinar, complete a brief quiz, and the webinar evaluation. More information on this will be given to you at the end of today's webinar. At the completion of our webinar today, you will be given an opportunity for feedback, and we really would value your taking advantage of that and providing us with some feedback. Finally, if you've registered for the webinar, you will be emailed a link to view the archived recording. This link will also be available on the RTP website, where you will find links to past RTP webinars as well. This series is hosted by SAMHSA's Recovery to Practice. The overarching goal of this initiative is to improve the knowledge and ability of the behavioral health workforce to use recovery-oriented practices every day. But what do we mean when we talk about recovery-oriented practices? In 2011, SAMHSA released a working definition of recovery and a set of guiding principles that incorporate aspects of recovery from both substance use and mental health conditions. SAMHSA's working definition of recovery in behavioral health is a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. Along with the four major dimensions of recovery, home, health, purpose, community, form a solid foundation for developing recovery-oriented lives and for building recovery-oriented services and systems necessary to support them. SAMHSA's Recovery to Practice initiative helps you to turn these principles into workforce priorities. Recovery to Practice offers a set of discipline-based curricula to promote understanding and uptake of recovery principles and practices. Developed by these 6 professional disciplines for educating their membership about recovery and behavioral health, these materials are adaptable for use by other disciplines and organizations seeking resources to build a recovery-oriented workforce. Links to these curricula are available at the RTP website. And RTP is expanding its discipline focus to embrace multidisciplinary services and integrated settings. Those of us who work in behavioral health or integrated health care organizations have opportunities every day to promote wellness and recovery. We can powerfully communicate hope for recovery and the value of self-care and wellness just in how we approach our work. RTP can help you strengthen your recovery-oriented practice through free webinars, newsletters, and training and technical assistance opportunities. Many of us recognize that with crisis, though, comes opportunity for growth, but all too often, however, individuals and their families who face a mental health crisis experience fear, disempowerment, and even trauma. Today's presentation is part of a 3-part series that examines a number of ways to integrate recovery-oriented approaches into responses and support services to help individuals in these crucial periods. I'd now like to introduce our speakers for today. Chris Gordon has been a psychiatrist, medical director, and senior administrator for Advocates Incorporated for the past 19 years. He's responsible for all clinical programs, including residential services, outpatient, emergency services, and employment services. He's deeply involved in working with people who are dealing with psychiatric illness and those who are in advanced recovery. Pardon me. As well as Chris works with NAMI and other family and consumer organizations. Chris is also an associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, where he teaches residents in psychiatry in training at McLean and Massachusetts General Hospital. Keith Scott is the Vice President of Peer Support and Self-Advocacy at Advocates, where he has been a vital contributor and leader since 1989. Keith was originally hired for his psychiatric lived experience and has been a lifelong user of psychiatric services, both voluntarily and involuntarily. He has worked in a variety of positions, including direct care counselor, program manager, and prior to his current role, as the Director of Recovery and Peer Support. Keith is passionate about the rights of individuals with mental health diagnoses and has worked to create systems that support the autonomy of people, amplify their voices, advocate for their rights, and provide access to information and resources, particularly those resources available outside of the mental health system. I'm thrilled to have you both, and with that, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Keith and I are really thrilled to be here today, and we really appreciate everyone coming on and participating in this webinar with us about recovery-oriented crisis services. Keith and I and our colleagues and many of the people we support have been working for many, many years trying to make our services more recovery-oriented. And Keith and I want to emphasize from the very beginning that for us this is a journey, not a destination. We know we have a lot further to go before we'll have the kind of recovery-oriented services to which we aspire. But we would like to highlight in this webinar about crisis services two elements of our work that have been particularly important. The first is to appreciate the immense value of having a robust peer specialist team. Having this team under Keith's leadership has shifted our work in so many different ways toward a more recovery-oriented orientation. And this has touched every element of our company, and we want to highlight the role of peers in our crisis services today. The other element of our work that we would like to highlight today is the way we have been trying over the last 5 or 6 years to adapt elements of open dialogue into all of our clinical services, including crisis services. And we'll go into more detail about what open dialogue is in the body of the webinar, but very briefly, open dialogue is a mode of working with people in emotional or mental health crisis developed in Tornio, Finland over the last 25 years, which is predicated on the idea that when we are in a severe emotional or mental health crisis, it's best to receive help rapidly and in the least pathologizing, most comfortable setting possible, and to include in dealing with the crisis our family or other people whom we choose, whom we would find to be helpful resources. The other thing about open dialogue that's very important is that the help that's offered does not begin with a prior assumption that a medical or psychiatric model is the best paradigm through which to view the problem, and instead really attempts to meet the person and his or her network where they are. So with that introduction, let me just say that the crisis services that we aspire to are services that are welcoming, respectful, helpful, accessible, and safe. The touchstone for us would be that these would be crisis services that the people who receive services themselves would themselves endorse and recommend to others. And finally, that the crisis services that we envision would reduce, mitigate, or ideally eliminate completely the real risks that people experience when they turn to professionals for help in a mental health crisis. And as we'll discuss in this webinar, these risks are very real. We also want to invite you to participate in this webinar by completing a poll, which I think will be up on the screen shortly, in which we ask your opinion about what you think the main obstacles are to crisis-oriented to recovery-oriented crisis services. And with that, let me turn to my colleague, Keith.
Thank you, Chris. So I'm just going to briefly talk about the agency that we work for. I want to thank everybody for participating today, and thank you, Elizabeth. Advocates is a full-service, private, nonprofit human service agency that's been providing residential outreach, outpatient, and emergency services for 40 years now. This is our 40th anniversary this year. And we have worked really hard, particularly in the last 20 years, to make our agency and our services and supports as recovery-oriented as possible, to minimize the use of coercion and force in our services, and to maximize support for people's autonomy, for their right to live their life as they choose and create a life of their own design. And of course, that's our aspiration, right? We are nowhere near that goal. The reality is we still exercise some use of force and coercion under certain circumstances, regrettably. We still serve people who have guardianships, who have conservators, who have representative payeeships who control their money. We have people who are being medicated every day by our staff, sometimes when they don't really want to be. So we understand that we're not where we want to be, but this is about the journey, and so that's kind of what we're here to talk about. It's a journey that we're on. I'm assuming it's the journey of everybody who's participating in the webinar today, and I'm hopeful that some of the things that we have to say will be of use to you.
Thank you, Keith. I'd like to now talk a little bit about the obstacles to providing recovery-oriented crisis services in conventional settings. Because for many people, the place that they turn and the only place that may be available in a mental health or emotional crisis is a hospital emergency room. And hospital emergency rooms can really be pretty difficult places to receive recovery-oriented care. Part of the reason for this is that the paradigm from which emergency medical personnel are proceeding is that there's a really high premium on identifying serious or life-threatening conditions and making an extremely rapid, accurate diagnosis and then intervening promptly on the basis of that diagnosis. And if we go to an emergency room with a possible stroke or a heart attack, that's exactly what we want. However, if we're in an emotional crisis, a mental health crisis of some kind, and we turn to an emergency room, this paradigm may be very, very ill-suited to our needs. And anyone who has gone to a hospital emergency room can probably attest to the fact that that is an environment that is often difficult to provide recovery-oriented services in, or to find recovery-oriented services in. The whole atmosphere can be quite unwelcoming. The welcoming staff or the admitting staff may really overlook the perspective of the person seeking care, especially if the person is known to have a psychiatric history. The admitting or registering person may jump to really unwarranted conclusions about the nature of the problem or what is being sought. And the emergency room personnel may unwittingly use methods both to figure out what's wrong and to try to intervene that can actually substantially complicate the problem rather than help it. In fact, as we will see, some of the experiences in ordinary emergency rooms can be traumatizing, particularly if, as is so very often the case, people have had previous bad experiences in these settings. Then the experience can be both traumatizing and re-traumatizing. Now I'd like to turn back over to Keith to talk a little bit about the nature of the sorts of problems for which people come for care.
So when we think about crisis, I believe that there are as many different ways that a person can experience what is called a crisis as there are paths to recovery. I think crisis is something that can feel overwhelming in the moment. It's something that either has been building for a while that sort of boils over into a crisis, or sometimes it's very extemporaneous. Something could happen in the person's life, and there's a sense of immediacy to the crisis. And, you know, it's certainly true that sometimes a crisis can be dangerous. It can be dangerous for the person, particularly if they don't have adequate supports in place. And it can be dangerous for family members, friends, neighbors. And that's very important to pay attention to. I think, you know, as Elizabeth said in the opening, you know, I think we try to approach this with the view that I learned about through training with Sherry Mead in intentional peer support, that crisis can be viewed, should be viewed as a real opportunity, as an opportunity for growth for the person, as an opportunity to develop some skills about, you know, how to manage what they're experiencing in a way that's effective for them. Growth in confidence, in the ability to manage future crises should they occur. And I think, you know, not only do we want to approach the crisis with the sense that this is an opportunity, I think we also have an obligation to approach the person in crisis with a sense of hope about a resolution that will be satisfactory for the person and help enhance, ultimately, the quality of their life. That it's not just something to survive, but it is something that they can certainly build on, and that can add to their skill set in terms of their ability to deal with future crisis events. I think, you know, we want to look at it as a story that the person has to tell, and we want to ask the person to tell that story. I think we want to avoid making assumptions about what the person is experiencing. And I think we want to view it in a holistic context. Even though the origin of the crisis might be in an interpersonal relationship, for example, or in a social relationship, or in a familial relationship, or it could be medical in nature, or biological in nature, or potentially psychological or emotional, or even religious or spiritual, it doesn't exist on one of those planes separate from the other. It occurs in the context of all of these aspects of who the person is. And I think we really want to approach it in that way, because I think the solutions for people sort of evolve out of an understanding that this is not just happening in one part of their life. So the next question is, you know, what do we need in a crisis? What does a person need in a crisis? I think there are definitely helpful attitudes and approaches that we want to be considering. Most significantly among them, perhaps, is the role of culture, values, religious and spiritual beliefs, economic status, those kinds of things. I think an approach that is trauma-informed, that understands that this is a very sort of fragile situation, and we don't want to do anything, as Chris was mentioning, in the context of providing support for someone in a crisis that's going to do additional harm, that's going to make matters worse. So we want to pay close attention to that. You know, I think we want to be asking the person what happened. We want to avoid defaulting to a clinical lens and assuming that what the person is experiencing is just a set of symptoms that have been exacerbated by, you know, a refusal to take medications, for example. And really ask the person what they're experiencing and what it's meaning to them in the moment. I think we want to consider what kind of support we can offer the person, what would be helpful in terms of support, whether that's family support, friends, peer support that's, you know, based on shared lived experience and a sense of mutuality. I think we want to help the person to feel safe. And I think when we do that, we ask the person what made them feel safe in the past. What could we do to replicate that? I think we want to offer comfort and compassion, and I think we want to be mindful of being transparent about what's happening, because I think one of the scariest things when you're in crisis is sort of this sense of loss of control. You don't know what's happening. You don't know who's talking about you, what kinds of decisions are being made about you. And towards that end, I think we want to be focused on making sure that the person is included wherever possible in conversations about what's happening to them, what their options might be, what people are thinking, and obviously to be involved in any planning moving forward. And then finally, I think, we want to be patient. Sometimes crisis resolves itself in the course of time, and if we can be patient and not rush to judgment, and again, not do anything that's going to exacerbate the situation or harm the person additionally, sometimes things start to resolve themselves. And if we can, on top of being patient, if we can provide some space for the person and some meaningful options to give them, including things like additional staffing support, additional peer support, either through friends or community peer support or through professional peer specialists that work for a provider. If we can consider respite options, if they're available, including things like peer-run respites, then I think we're doing what we can do to assist a person who's experiencing the crisis in a way that's recovery-oriented and really focused on, again, supporting that person's autonomy. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the recovery principles. I know Elizabeth showed the slide with the principles and the domains in the beginning of the presentation. But just to mention a couple of things. Again, I think hope is exceedingly important. I think us as professionals supporting people through crisis, approaching the person with a hopeful attitude in our heart that this can be resolved in a way that's going to ultimately add to the person's abilities to be resilient, to be strong, and to deal with crisis down the road. I think, again, approaching this with the idea that crisis occurs in a holistic context, that culture, values, and beliefs are vital to the process of recovering through a crisis. I think we also need to be mindful and sensitive to issues related to prejudice, discrimination, and oppression. Many people, particularly those who've had multiple experiences in the mental health system, have experienced the loss of control, the loss of civil and human rights, and it can sort of lay the groundwork for the person's interpretation of what help is when they're having a crisis. And I think, again, we want to do everything that we can to not sort of reinforce that idea and to be really trauma-focused and trauma-sensitive. I think we want to be paying attention to the balance between the responsibility of care that we have as providers and professionals in supporting a person through a crisis with the need for and the right of the person to continue to make choices about their life, as many choices as are possible given the context of what's happening to them. And then finally, relationships. I think the value of peer support where it's available to people is in the relationship that's built fundamentally on a shared lived experience, connection through that, mutuality, and honest communication. And so those are the things I think we want to be paying really close attention to when we're thinking about how recovery principles influence the work that we do when someone's in a crisis.
Thank you, Keith. I think the audience can probably see easily why I feel like I died and went to heaven to have a colleague like Keith and to have the certified peer specialist team as partners in my work. I want to speak just briefly about some common missteps that I think professionals particularly make in the delivery of crisis services to people who are in emotional or mental health crisis. And the main one is simply not listening, not taking the time to see the person as a unique individual in a unique situation and to really appreciate the dilemma that person is in. And instead, under the pressure of time, under the pressure of the culture of the emergency room perhaps, there's a tendency to draw unwarranted conclusions, to make unwarranted assumptions, to offer unhelpful, unwelcome, and sometimes downright hurtful speculations about diagnostic ideas. And these have in common the toxicity of the clinical gaze, in which the person feels treated more like an object than as a human being and a full partner. Another element of this phenomenon is that under the pressure to figure out what's wrong, sometimes we really fail to take note of and to appreciate the strengths and coping capacities of the person. And of course, a very common one to which we can probably all relate is when any of us goes to the emergency room, pretty much the first thing that happens is, even if we were brought there by friends and family, we get ushered into the bowels of the emergency room while our support system waits in the waiting room. So separating people from their critical supports. I've already alluded to this on the previous slide, but sometimes the language that psychiatric and medical professionals use is truly ugly and really downright harmful, especially if this is arising in the absence of a real relationship in which both people know what they're talking about and there's a feel for the sensibilities of each person. This is even more true, I think, in the tendency in emergency services for the treating personnel to feel like they have to do something. Now, this may be because of the obvious distress of the person who's come for care, or it may be the distress of the people who brought the person for care, or it may be the distress of the caregiver himself or herself. I simply can't stand it. I feel like I have to do something. And unfortunately, this sometimes leads us to use treatments that are strong, powerful, sometimes very toxic, and to implement these treatments in the absence of a real relationship with the person, which would be absolutely necessary for any kind of authentic, informed consent. Now I'd like to turn back to Keith to talk about the role of peer specialists in the emergency service.
Thanks, Chris. I glanced down at some of the results of the poll question, and I'm not sure if it's continued to change, but I noticed that the two sort of most popular responses had to do with the culture of the emergency room as an impediment to a recovery approach to crisis care, and the lack of training of emergency room staff as well. And I would absolutely agree with that. I think it's one of the things that we focused on when sort of going about creating a plan to provide peer support in psychiatric settings, particularly in emergency rooms. One of the things that we wanted to do right up front is to try to engage the staff of the emergency room, whether that was the nursing staff, doctors, administrative staff, to have a conversation about the value that peer support could bring to their emergency room setting, the value for them as professionals attempting to manage a lot of different crises occurring all at the same time, and the value to the person who is in the ER in crisis. We also wanted to give them an opportunity to talk about their concerns and allay as many of those as we could up front. Part of the way in which we do that is we have a conversation about what the roles are, what the role of the peer specialist is specifically in providing support in the ER, and what it's not, what they as staff in the emergency room, which is kind of their setting where they work, can expect from us and what they shouldn't expect. We also want to educate the peer specialist providing that support about emergency room policies and emergency room culture, both the formal culture and also the informal culture. What's the role of nursing? What's the role of security? What can they expect when they're there? Just so there are as few surprises as possible. We want to be really clear with the peer specialists working in these settings that they're a guest. And we want them to be really focused on trying to, while they're there, in addition to providing support to people, build relationships with the other professionals there so that this can be an ongoing, developing, evolving partnership. Because I think that's the context in which these types of services and supports can be best delivered and most effective. We really wanted to be clear about identifying an ongoing process for us to continue to sort of talk about how is it going, debrief incidents that were potentially problematic, have a system for sorting out and solving problems as they arise. And again, at the end of the day, much like the connection to the people that we're supporting who might be in crisis, we're really focused on building relationships, because that's kind of what sustains these types of initiatives. Without that, we've found that it's very, very easy for peer specialists working in these settings to get marginalized, demoralized, and no longer want to provide those services, as well as the ER staff feeling like this is not something that they really want to invest in. For the individual who's being supported in the psychiatric setting or ER, we're really focused on providing that support that's based on shared lived experience and mutuality. We want to be with the person in crisis. We want to spend a lot of our time listening. We want to provide that person with access to information about things like our experience of how this process sort of unfolds, what they can expect, how long it might take. We want to be able to provide advocacy for that person to understand what their rights are under these particular circumstances, what their rights are, should they be sectioned, should they be committed to the hospital. We want to help the person wherever possible participate in all discussions about their care and their treatment while in crisis, consistent with the idea of nothing about us without us. And then we want to pay attention to the simple things, like helping that person feel as comfortable as possible, given that they're in an emergency room, they're probably separated from family and friends. If that person's thirsty, we want to get the person a drink. If they're cold, we want to get them an extra blanket. Obviously, we want to be paying attention to the rules of the ER so as not to violate those, but really we're focused on trying to help the person be as comfortable as possible. And we want to try to make a connection. It's really hard to do in a short amount of time. I mean, it's a little bit easier now given that people are boarding in ERs for longer periods of time, but given the relatively short amount of time that we have to connect with the person, we want to try to connect. And finally, I think we want to try to check in with the person about whether they'd like some follow-up from us, a visit in the hospital, a phone call when they go home, for us to stop by and visit and check and see how they're doing.
Thanks, Keith. I'd like to turn now to a few comments about open dialogue, but before I do, I just want to make one fast comment about what Keith was saying. I think that idea of building real relationships with the emergency room personnel is absolutely critical. And I realized as I was listening to Keith that my own comments about the emergency room personnel were kind of snarky, and that really doesn't help matters. It's far, far better for us to go down the path that Keith is talking about building real relationships and showing people how these services can actually enhance their work and what they're striving for too. So now just a few words about open dialogue. As I mentioned in the introductory moments, open dialogue is a mode of working with people that was developed in Tornio, Finland, a method of working with people in mental health crisis that emphasizes the idea that when we are in a severe crisis, what we need is to get help fast in the least pathologizing setting possible and to have access to our loved ones, not to be isolated from them, and to have an opportunity to speak openly about what all the options are and what we want to have happen and what we don't want to have happen. And that's basically what open dialogue is all about. In Tornio, Finland, where this process developed, if a person is in psychiatric crisis or mental health crisis and calls their team, a team is immediately embodied that will travel to the person's home, if at all possible, and involve the family or other natural supports. As we practice open dialogue, the person at the center of concern gets veto power as to whom they want and don't want in this network meeting. But the idea is to be flexible, to involve natural supports as the person at the center of concern desires, and then to promote a dialogue among that group about what's going on and what would be helpful and what would be unhelpful. The clinical team assumes responsibility for providing whatever is necessary, whatever emerges from that meeting, and to provide that for whatever frequency and for whatever length is necessary, but not a minute more, because there's a desire to help people in crisis restore their capacity to engage in living and then kind of get out of the way so that people are not drawn into a chronic engagement with the mental health system. The other critical element of open dialogue is what is known as tolerating uncertainty. And that is that the open dialogue team wants to approach the person in crisis and the network without any preconceived ideas about how best to understand what's going on and what would be most helpful. That extends to the idea that we don't begin with an idea that this is necessarily a crisis best understood psychiatrically or medically. And that means moving slowly to diagnosis if it's safe to do so, and only using diagnostic categories or medical paradigms if it emerges that they are either helpful or necessary. Then the last element is what I like to call gentle psychopharmacology, which means, as Keith points out, many times crises resolve on their own if we don't freeze them and make them worse. So for that reason, there's a premium in open dialogue on not moving fast to either offer diagnosis and also not to offer treatment so that we can see how things may evolve naturally. The meetings with the person and the network can involve whomever the person prefers, and these meetings can occur wherever it's convenient to do it. They could be convened in an emergency room or the person's home. When we provide services to people on a long-term basis, we like to convene these meetings when things are going well in order to plan for a future crisis should one arise as part of a wellness or crisis plan. But the setting is really optimal where people are most comfortable and it's least pathologizing. Now, just a couple of words about what happens in these meetings. They're pretty unstructured and open-ended, and the clinicians follow the lead of the family and network as the problem is explored. As Keith mentioned, it's more of a narrative explanation. There's more emphasis on stories, more emphasis on what has happened, less emphasis on what is wrong. There is something very important about the conduct of the clinicians, though, that I would like to emphasize, and that is what I'm calling total clinical transparency. In an open dialogue meeting, there's always more than one clinical person present, and the clinicians make an agreement with the person at the center of concern and the network that the clinicians will make no substantial decisions about the person except in the presence of the person and the network. And included in that is that the clinicians will engage in conversation about the options, including sometimes strenuous disagreements, in front of the person and the family, and then invite the person and family to respond or comment. This does not mean that the decisions are necessarily made on a purely democratic basis. At times, the situation becomes so dangerous that we have to act unilaterally, such as it might be necessary to commit someone to a hospital. But even in that circumstance, the decision is made openly, transparently, and with an opportunity for people to comment. Lastly, there is an emphasis in open dialogue on modest goals, helping people to accomplish what the Finns call restoring their grip on life. And then, as I say, getting out of the way so people are not drawn into chronicity. And now we'd like to, oh no, I have one more slide, sorry. We have three programs at Advocates that involve the open dialogue model. One is called the Collaborative Pathway, which is designed to identify and serve people with early episode psychosis in hopes of avoiding chronicity. The second is a program called Open Dialogue in Community-Based Flexible Supports, which is the program we offer for people who are engaged with the Department of mental health. And then the third is the program that I'm going to turn this back to Keith to talk about, which is a very exciting partnership between our crisis team and our peer specialist team.
Thanks, Chris. So we do two basic things. We've had peer specialists that have worked with crisis clinicians, and we've been very fortunate here that we operate the psychiatric emergency services for a large geographical area. So the crisis clinicians that we partner with are also employees of our agency. But even still, it was important that we have an understanding of each other's roles, expectations about how we'll be working together, an understanding of each other's code of ethics in the course of the work. And we really want to be focused on sort of how best to use the time. And we try to use downtime to have ongoing conversations with those crisis clinicians and those teams of clinicians to have the hard conversation about the things that I think Chris mentioned a little bit earlier, things like diagnostic language and sort of attitudes of chronicity and the impact of force and coercion, those kinds of things. And as much as possible, we want to be working with the crisis clinicians proactively to prevent crisis or mitigate crisis as much as possible. And that involves kind of getting out into the community sooner, before the crisis actually occurs, or involves doing some planning with people around how they want to be treated in a crisis. And we use RAP plans and other sort of crisis planning models to help people do that. We also are focused on keeping and reviewing data, so we know sort of how those relationships are going and what kind of impact they're having on people in terms of their ability to remain in the community, stay at home, continue working, continue going to school, as opposed to ending up in the hospital. Now, this one great pilot that we've been working on for about the last 7 months involves embedding a crisis clinician, an experienced crisis clinician, someone who knows the community-based flexible support system, which is essentially our residential system, who worked as a residential counselor, who worked as a program manager, and who's now a crisis clinician. Pairing that person with an experienced peer specialist, somebody who's also worked in hospital settings as a peer specialist, has worked in the community as a peer specialist, and they go out together. They're fully mobile. They're not tied to an office. They can go out and respond to crisis. They can do evaluations, but they can also do that proactive work that I talked about earlier. And I think the idea is to offer as much support and service as far upstream in crisis as possible, so that we can avoid crisis if at all possible. And this has been quite amazing for us, because it's really helped keep a number of the people who are high users of emergency room services out of the emergency room, out of the hospital. It's reduced our use of force, and 7 months in, we're very, very optimistic about this for the future.
Thanks, Keith. And it's worth emphasizing that both Paul and Abby spend a lot of time in the community in these programs when there isn't a crisis, and therefore when a person is seen by either of them when they are in crisis, they're seeing a familiar face. They're seeing somebody that they know, and you just can't overstate how helpful that is, as opposed to being in crisis already to begin with and then going and meeting with strangers. So we'd like to offer a few simple ideas in closing, and then talk a little bit about our other efforts to become more recovery-oriented, and then we look forward to some dialogue with you. So some simple ideas to kind of reiterate is that the whole tone of crisis services needs to be uncrisis-like. It needs to be friendly, what I like to call neighborly, warm. We need to convey to people that we're glad that they have come, that we feel they've come to the right place. It has to be unhurried. It really has to be almost like offering a person a cup of tea. Just let's take some time, breathe. It really helps to not separate people from their loved ones and their supports. and to listen attentively and with an open heart and open mind to whatever those resources have to suggest. Keith has already talked about the importance of offering simple supports. And, you know, all of us can relate to that. You know, if we're stressed out and somebody offers us a warm drink or a warm blanket, it says a great deal. And from my point of view as a psychiatrist, I can't say enough about ceding control in every way that it is possible to do it. Give people as many choices as you can about as many things as you can. Prescribe information and choices over the prescription of treatments. The other thing, to repeat something I said a little bit earlier, is to really notice and appreciate everyone's strengths, to notice what people are doing to cope. If we walk a mile in the shoes of the people that we're serving, we can't help but be awed by their accomplishments in surviving and in coping as well as they do. It really helps to ask what has helped in the past and to elicit and honor the person's ideas no matter what they may be. And as I've said before, to imagine modest goals. Lastly, if you have not already developed a robust peer specialist team, I can't urge you strongly enough to do so. Let me turn it for the last word over to Keith.
This is going to be tough to pull off in 3 minutes, but many of the things that we have done to become a more recovery-oriented agency, we've done over the last 20 years, we continue to do. Initially, we started by bringing Dr. Patricia Deegan in to consult with us about how we could become a more recovery-oriented agency. She spent about 5 years with us helping us to develop some performance standards for people working in direct service roles to work in ways that support and nurture recovery, and that help supervisors to supervise direct service staff in ways that further our goal of becoming more recovery-oriented. We began shortly thereafter training all of our staff in these intentional care performance standards, and then we began to try to evaluate the impact it was having. We started off using a tool called Recovery Enhancing Environment Measure, which we administered twice to see how people felt we were doing as an organization and becoming more recovery-oriented. Then we began to focus more on the perspective of the people we're serving to see how they felt about their own recovery process, and we began to use two tools, one the Milestones of Recovery Measure and another one called the Mental Health Recovery Measure, to get their perspective. In addition, we've sort of partnered with organizations in the community that are run by people with lived experience and staffed by people with lived experience, like the Transformation Center and Empower and the National Empowerment Center. And we've collaborated on initiatives. We've brought in many speakers who are leaders around the world in alternative perspectives to this thing that we call mental illness, and in alternative treatments. People like Bruce Levine and David Cohen and Rufus May and Robert Whitaker. We continue to train our staff, particularly our peer specialists, in skills that allow them to reinforce for people that recovery is possible, that it happens all the time, and it happens in a billion different ways. Our staff are trained in, excuse me, intentional peer support and vocational peer support and wellness recovery action planning, things of that nature. Under Chris's leadership, of course, we brought open dialogue into the organization, which has been amazingly transformative in that it really conveys this idea that that people at the center of concern should have as much control over the process as possible, shouldn't be isolated from their family, from their friends, from their colleagues at work or at school, and that what we want to help people do is make meaning of their experience rather than medicate it and hospitalize the person, because ultimately when the person makes meaning of their experience, they're able to manage. And as Chris said, the goal is really to have them sort of deflect off of the mental health system rather than become stuck in it forever. And then finally, you know, internally we decided that we wanted to promote the idea of disclosure for the purpose of providing that hope in that example that people do recover and move forward with their lives by starting a group called the Promoting a Culture of Respect group, where our employees can come and talk about the challenges of disclosing and get support for disclosing, again, for the purposes of conveying this message that many, many people deal with these kinds of challenges and move forward with their lives. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for being here. We'll turn it back over to you, Elizabeth. Ooh. Can't hear her.
Sorry about that. I was on mute. So let me start again just saying that you've done a really beautiful, eloquent job of kind of conveying and talking about the principles of recovery-oriented care that so many of us aspire to in such a way of really helping us understand how to bring it into day-to-day practice. And it's so valued. I've got notes all over my note page here of some of the really lovely things that you talked about in terms of, Keith was talking about a sense of hope about resolution and not just surviving crisis, and the idea that solutions will evolve if we stick with people and take time. Chris, you used the phrase of prescribing information and choices over treatments. I mean, really some very, very evocative and lovely ways, and very practical as well. Lots and lots of questions. I'm going to start, Keith, here's a question for you. Someone was asking, how long did it take you to develop a good working relationship with the ER personnel, and is that ongoing because there are changes in staffing and whatnot, or what advice do you have for others who are interested in that work that you've done?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an ongoing process. We have no illusions about sort of where we are, and you're correct. I mean, I think ER staff change, and depending on when we're there and which staff are working, sometimes problems come up that we then set a meeting to sit down and try to resolve. I mean, I think the goal is to really just hang in there because it can be really challenging. I think both for the peer specialist who's in there trying to do a job, support a person who's in crisis, advocate for that person to have as many rights and choices as possible, while keeping in mind that the ER staff are very accustomed to doing things in a certain way and have their own set of rules and their own culture there. So, I guess my advice is to just continue to hang in there, to not give up, and continue to try to engage and build good relationships where you can. When we were talking about that little pilot program, that's done wonders for our relationship with one particular emergency room, in that they've noticed that a number of people who are there frequently aren't there as frequently. And so that sort of paved the way for us to be able to support other people there more effectively.
That's fantastic. Thank you. That really describes it. It really is it's a relationship-based work. It parallels everywhere. Someone was asking how they could learn more about the crisis clinician and peer work, that pilot that you have described.
I think you're going to show folks my email address at the end. If they would like to email me, I'm happy to send them information about what we've done with some preliminary data that we're gleaning right now, and I can give folks my phone number and they can call and speak with me if they so choose.
Great, thank you. I imagine you may get some calls. That's nice. Thank you. Chris, this is a question for you. This is going specifically to when you were talking about open dialogue, and you're talking about that in the way that you are using open dialogue principles, that the person at the center of concern has kind of, I think you called it, veto power about who's involved. How do you end up working with support people who might be physically with someone? Let's say someone has come to an emergency room or to a crisis center, and the person at the center of concern says, I don't want them involved. How do you handle that, and how do you work with the support person?
That's a tough one. That's a tough one, because we may be in a position in an emergency where we absolutely have to know what the support person has to tell us. But to the greatest extent possible, we would try to honor the request of the person at the center of concern. And, as Keith was saying before, even in circumstances where we can't honor the preferences of the person at the center of concern, we do have some principles for how to think about that. One is to be completely honest and transparent about it, not to try to put any spin on the ball, and having and acknowledge that that's the position we're in. So, for example, if the decision is that on the basis of our assessment, we feel that a person has to be hospitalized involuntarily, it may be a small comfort, but at least it's something to ask people. Do you have a preference about a hospital that you would prefer or one you would really prefer to avoid? Is there anybody you'd like to talk to or like us to talk to about that? Anything that we can extend the realm of choice to. And that would probably be the case too. Like I really feel like I need to speak to the support person at least to hear what they have to say. I promise you I'll tell you exactly what they tell me, or better yet, we could have them come in and speak in front of you. But I won't give any information without your permission. That might be an example.
That's a lovely example, and I imagine that what happens in the heat of acute crisis can change as things calm down and different choices can be made.
Absolutely. Keith made the point that most of the time crises resolve on their own. And much of the mischief in crisis services is trying to make decisions too fast. If we have somebody in the emergency room who's having a lot of difficulty, if it's possible for them and us to just take a couple hours, get some sleep, and look at the same situation the next day in the light of day, it often looks radically better. Picture of time.
Thank you. We have just a couple of minutes, and I'm going to shift the questions just a tiny bit, because this is a question that is more personal to you, but I think it's a lovely question, which is, as a medically trained psychiatrist, what made you focus on recovery-oriented care?
Well, I think a bit of a small breed, because I'm a really happy psychiatrist. I absolutely love being a psychiatrist at Advocates, and I feel like it lets me be the doctor I wanted to be when I went to medical school. And I get to use all my medical skills and all my skills as a doctor, and I get to think about biology, psychology, social factors, spiritual factors. And, to me, being a doctor is about helping people who are suffering. And this is the best setting I've ever had for being the kind of doctor I want to be.
If I could just interject something, Elizabeth, one of the things that's so impressive about Chris and his support of this at this organization has been he sends new psychiatrists and psychiatry interns to the peer specialist team meeting, even having them spend an entire day shadowing peer specialists. So I think that we communicate how important we view that resource in the organization to what it is we're trying to do, and to, I think, orient new psychiatrists to this is how we work here at Advocates. I mean, it's really just been astonishing to see.
I really appreciate that, Keith. And it's pretty simple that if you think what you would if you think what you would want for someone you deeply loved, this is the care I would want for someone I deeply loved, or for myself.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And that's a perfect principle to end on and to reflect on. You both have, I really can't thank you enough, and I know that we could continue to talk. You both have modeled so beautifully the collaborative care that you're talking about, and the collaborative approach that you're talking about.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
So here as we talked about here, is that some Keith's and Chris's email addresses if someone wants to communicate with them and talk with them more about their presentation. We also invite you to email us at Recovery to Practice with comments or questions. And we're very excited about the final webinar in this series, which will be next Tuesday, February 2nd It will be about hospital diversion and alternatives in crisis response. So please join us if you can. And remember, if you can't join us, to check the Recovery to Practice website, where we will have all of these webinars archived. So thank you so much. If you're interested in receiving the NADAC continuing education hours, then you can click on the link here on your screen, where you'll be directed to a page with an evaluation and a quiz to complete to receive your certificate. And if you're not interested, you can, or don't need those CEHs, but you can download a certificate of participation in the materials download box near the bottom of your screen. Please also complete the feedback opportunity that will automatically load directly following this webinar. We do find your input very useful. So on behalf of SAMHSA, I'd like to thank you all for taking time out of your busy days to attend today's webinar. We really do appreciate your interest and all of your questions and input. This concludes our call. Have a wonderful afternoon.